God's message for us today is quite simple, and yet it's the best sort of simple. It's simply good. It's a simply good message that God's not done at all. Working in this world, God's not done at all. Working in our lives, God, another way to put it, is still alive. God's still acting, still loving, still speaking, still elbowing his way into this world in a million ways we could never even guess. And yet through faith somehow increasingly have eyes to see. The simple good news for us today is God's not done. Do not remember the former things, or consider the things of old. See, I'm about to do a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? With these words, Isaiah insists that God remains at work. And God's best work, in fact, lies ahead. God is working right now. God's moving forward. As we speak, God has a plan for today and for tomorrow. God didn't pause or turn back or sit down or sit still or sit this one out. God didn't take a break or decide, I think I've had enough. That'll do. No, God didn't wear out or wear down. God didn't take a breather. God's acting right now, moving this moment. God, for each and every one of us, is going ahead of us. All of which means the best things about your life, your precious life, they don't just exist in the rearview mirror of your life. And yet, that's hard to accept some days, isn't it? Certainly hard to accept some weeks, like this week, when we lost Walt. I mean, even at our most optimistic, it's still hard to embrace an uncertain future. And after all, what other sort of future is there? Especially if we love the past, or really even just the now. It's terribly difficult not to cling to a cherished past. Certainly, I'm inclined to do that. I mean, everybody who knows me even a little knows I like to get things in order and then hold them tight. Hold them right there as long as possible. Things are finally right, I think. I've got it together, fixed, nailed down, established. So let me cling to this present right now so that some future wrong doesn't intrude. Because after all, who knows what's going to happen in the future? Everything's uncertain in the future. All you really know about the future is change is inevitable with the future, and change is always ripe ground for a harvest of concern. And so it's just better to hold on to what you got now, because who knows about scary tomorrow. And yet, here's the thing. God isn't afraid of tomorrow. God's not afraid of the future. Listen to him. Do not remember the former things, or consider the things of old. See, I'm about to do a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? You know, amazingly, Isaiah says this. He tells his hearers to not remember the former things or consider the things of old immediately after he himself talks about former things and considers the things of old. I don't know if you listened to that in the lesson, but it's right there. Isaiah speaks about this great triumph that was the Exodus story of his ancestors. He revels in this wonderful, sacred history of God bringing the Hebrew slaves, his people in ancient times, out of slavery in Egypt into freedom. But then Isaiah immediately pivots. Do not remember the former things or consider the things of old, to which we might rightly say, Isaiah, you just spoke about the former things and considered the things of old, and then told us not to remember the former things or consider the things of old. So if you wouldn't mind, would you make up your mind? But see, I think we misunderstand Isaiah if we see his statement somehow mutually exclusive between the past and the future. What I mean is there are multiple ways to read a cherished past that impact very differently our sense of the future. For instance, it's totally possible to look at the past as inspiration for the future, to remember how God acted back then and moved in times gone by in order to perceive how God might continue to act now and move forward in times to come. I mean, when you see that God was alive yesterday, you begin to remember, aha, God's still alive today. And God's going to remain alive tomorrow. And at least to me, that's the proper way to consider the things of old. But there's another way to read the past, and it's in such a way that the past becomes kind of a trap. And this is the reading of the past that's done not to learn from it or to look forward to it, but only to reminisce about things gone by as though that was all that there could ever be. To replay the past over and over and over again as a never-ending loop that never allows you to move beyond it. Ah, the past. The glory days, never to be repeated. Good times that can't be replicated. That cherished bygone era when God was still alive. Back then. See, this was the precise misreading of the past that was being done by the people to whom Isaiah spoke these words in the first place. See, at the time that Isaiah spoke these words about God's new future, the people of Israel were suffering a terrible present. So much so that I guess some of them just kind of quit believing that God was even present in the present. The situation was they were in Babylon, this great mighty power. Babylon comes and takes over Israel, the southern part of it known as Judah, destroys the temple, decapitates the leadership in essence, and sends all of them to Babylon in exile. And so that's when Isaiah comes along with these words. For this suffering people taken by force from their homes into a pagan land, their present was a promised land overrun, a temple in ruins, subjugation to a foreign enemy intent on destroying any future that they could possibly imagine. Now they sat there and they knew their stories of old. They knew stories like the Exodus, these other older times when other older powers like Egypt held their ancestors helpless against their will in a foreign land, exactly their situation there, and of how God acted then, but they just thought that's just back then. That history's gone, it's remote, it's ancient. And yet, it wasn't gone for Isaiah. Isaiah read his divine history as prelude, as upcoming events. And so Isaiah sees God's movement through history, and he realizes we have a God on our hands who's on the move through history. He realizes that the God who acted yesterday might just still be alive today and might just have plans for tomorrow. And thus Isaiah sees a new exodus about to take place again for his people, a God once again wrapping the people of God up into the arms of God's care and, like in times gone by, about to take them into a future that couldn't be except by God's own making. Isaiah somehow sees that what God did so long ago for those Hebrew slaves, God's about to do again for these exiles, even though they quit believing in the future. And I think Isaiah's stretching all the way to today and saying to you and saying to me, we must remember that God's future lies beyond us too. Because God's not done with you. God's not done with me. God's not done with us. God's not done with this church. God's not done with this creation. Our God is marching on. Now, maybe you're not 100% there right now. Maybe your present circumstances don't allow you much traction to walk boldly into the future. Maybe your feet slip and slide in doubt, and I get that. I think it's okay to be uncertain. It's okay to doubt. I mean, notice that Jesus was not put on a cross by people with doubts. People who put Jesus on the cross were full of certitude. And I don't know about you, but as I read life, it's not always obvious to me exactly in every particular moment when and where God's acting in life. And yet, here's the thing. I've read my past enough to see God's hand undeniably at work within it. And the greatness of God's work in my past far exceeds my ability to doubt God's presence back there. And once I really see God back there, once I recognize God's undeniable presence back there, then it becomes not so overly hard to believe that God's still very much here, even when I don't immediately sense God here. And then it becomes a little bit easier to believe that the same God who was faithful to me in my past will remain faithful to me throughout my future. Because with this sort of God, past is always prelude. Now, in the book of Genesis, there's this wonderful story where Abraham and Sarah received these 3 surprise visitors at the Oaks of Mamre. Now, this story has it that these 3 strangers come to Abraham and Sarah's camp, and Abraham thinks it's wonderful, and he makes this tremendous feast for them, and he shows them all this hospitality, not even knowing who they are. But Sarah, being more realistic, only sees 3 strangers. What do they bring? Are they dangerous? So she stands back and just listens to what they have to say. But what they have to say is that the promises of God for Abraham and Sarah being the parents of nations, that all of that is still going to come true. That they're going to have a baby even though they're in their 80s, which they won't, but sounds terrible to me. That even though their past screams out barren, even though their history insists that there's nothing new possible for their future, the visitors say, God's still got a future. Now, we don't know exactly how Abraham hears all this news, but we do know how Sarah receives it. Sarah laughs. Sarah laughs because it's ridiculous. She laughs because she's too old for new things, especially new baby things. She laughs because she knows the world and barren past don't yield fertile futures. She laughs because she lives in a flat world where nothing ever changes, where God doesn't intrude, where 3 visitors are just 3 visitors and not divine ambassadors. She laughed because she believed that it's out and out impossible for anything new to break into this dead old world. But 9 months later, she laughed again after a birth, a promised birth into flesh and a son born out of her barren past named Isaac. Isaac, a name that literally means laughter. And with that name, it's like God saying, guess who always gets the last laugh? What sort of a world is it within which we live? Do we live in a world where God's at all alive? Into which God will ever intrude? A world where God acts and moves and speaks. Well, if you have just a little bit of hope of that, I encourage you to allow it to grow and take heart. Because if so, God hasn't stopped acting, speaking, or intruding. Because after all, if God was alive yesterday, God hasn't quit being alive today. And God will remain alive tomorrow. Because with this God, past is always prelude. Do not remember the former things, or consider the things of old. See, I'm about to do a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? Perceive it. Amen.